Wing Tek Lum is a Honolulu businessman and poet. Bamboo Ridge has published 3 collections of his poetry: Expounding the Doubtful Points, 1987, The Nanjing Massacre, poems, 2012, and the newly released Oldtimers, which is available for purchase right over there. In the Oldtimers, his 3rd collection of poetry, he imagines life in Honolulu Chinatown circa 1900, giving voice to the forgotten pioneer generation of sojourners and settlers, detailing the trials and temptations of this bachelor society living far from their homeland, their hard work, their diversions, their challenges, and even amidst the notorious plague and fire, their perseverance. I think you can see why the Center for Biographical Research would be interested in inviting Wing Tek here to speak today. We have published special issues of Biography, an interdisciplinary quarterly focused on biography and poetry, on documentary literature, and on literary archiving. And Wing Tek has explored similar methods before, most notably in the Nanjing Massacre of 2012, a series of moving, harrowing, and powerful poems that capture all perspectives of this 1937 tragedy, from the weary, casually cruel Japanese soldiers to the uncomprehending child victims, and from the desperate, helpless parents and the brutalized comfort women to the bloodless yet vicious bureaucrats of death. Drawing on published histories, memoirs, photographic collections, and oral histories, Wing Tek composes testimony after testimony for the silenced, poetic memorials that also provide some measure of revenge against the victors. In The Outsiders, he continues this process. But I also want to mention just a little bit about Wing Tek's own history with poetry in Hawaii. He has been honored with an American Book Award, the Discovery Nation Award, the Association of Asian American Studies Outstanding Book Award, and here in Hawaii, the Elliott Cades Award. And also, he has been a major figure in the history of the Bamboo Ridge Press as its treasurer, board member, and profound enabler of this remarkable venture, wending its way now toward 50 years. I'm very much looking forward to the poems and his talk. Wing Tek Lum.
In the store. The rumors about the fight at the sugar mill swirl around the saltfish and traveler's plums, the sleek sausages hanging under the open transom, the dried scallops, fat medallions of gold sorted by origin in wicker baskets. A barber comes in early to buy some young ginger, but stays a while to chat with the school teacher's petite wife who is looking for peanut oil. Before she leaves, she coaxes her toddler to recite a quatrain out loud. All the uncles applaud, and the little girl gets to choose a rock candy from the tall glass jar under the counter. In the far corner of the courtyard, besides blue bundles of fishing lines and nets, the letter writer at his table listens patiently as the house painter relates the death of his brother. The two agree, however, to omit any mention to his widow of how he had died of opium poisoning. As the two get up to leave, a kinsman who raises ducks by the marshes presses a small coin without a word into the painter's gaunt hand. At the long counter, the taro farmer arranges with the owner to settle his accounts. He confesses the work in the fields is too harsh and he must return to care for his ailing wife. The government postman arrives with a thin envelope addressed to the stonecutter in care of the store. It is placed inside a locked drawer behind the main counter and will be picked up by the old man when he and his native wife stop in as usual the next Sunday. At noon, a clerk is sent out to buy vegetables. Another clerk doubles as the cook, and everyone eats their lunches discreetly, standing at their stations. They leave the scraps for the pair of calico cats, just enough to keep them coming around, but not enough to stop their hunt for rats. Rather than losing it again, a gambler sends his night's winning to his mother. The cashier collects his money and will mail a coded letter back to the village where an elder holds a chest of silver for the store. The purveyor of bean curd pudding asks to barter for this week's delivery. Instead of cash, he will exchange his whole freshly made bucket for their best grade of tobacco. Surrounded by large tins of assorted tea in the storeroom off the kitchen, the owner's son fills out the manifests and shippers' declarations in between his English school assignments. rice growers gather in the wide front lanai to complain about the sparrows, dark flocks swooping, devouring their crops. A few talk about buying a scattergun as a last resort. In the mezzanine, where they keep imported abalone and decades-old tangerine peels, the fugitive and his supporters, heads bowed, murmur softly in earnest discussion about the next rally. Clerks later on clear out a space for a card table. Among the displays of kitchen crockery after work, the owner and his buddies will stick around for a night of gin rummy. Newly arrived, a teenager is introduced all around, where he is from, whom he is related to, what manner of work he has done. The old-timers take in his every word about home. What I just read is a poem that I conjured up, trying to describe a general store in Honolulu Chinatown, what it might be like around the year 1900. It was based on records I was able to dig up about my own grandfather's store, which was located opposite A'ala Park, just after the notorious fire. I pieced together information from the INS archives in San Bruno, some family stories, and even an essay which my father wrote as an assignment when he was a student here at the university. For instance, that the fishing lines at that time were wrapped in blue paper was from a recollection by one of my aunts. From some other relatives back in our village, we were told that one of my grandfather's brothers returned home because indeed he found the work here was too harsh and his wife was sick. My grandfather once reported that King Kalakau offered 10-cent bounties for farmers to kill sparrows eating their crops. However, they soon discovered that the gunpowder they used cost even more, and so dropped the idea. Lastly, there is family lore that my grandfather loved to play gin rummy, and once lost a large pot of money. So each of my poems has a history of how it itself got started, what inspired me to think about writing it. Today I'm going to share a few more poems with interesting backgrounds, some personal and others based on particular readings. Each of them were in some way adapted to fit into my project to imagine life in Honolulu Chinatown circa 1900. Last year, a friend told me about her early life in communist China, some stories about how hard it was for her family to survive in the first years after liberation, and also a memorable anecdote about the first night after she crossed the border into Hong Kong. I took her experience, including details of what she shared, and adapted it to the time period and setting of my book, with its history of the diaspora, which is where, at that time, families back in the village in China waited for men who went to Hawaii to make it rich and return home, or at least periodically send money back. This first poem is in 3 parts, each with a different speaker. It's entitled Childhood Memories. 1, Elder Sister. I made a game out of it. Both of us would gather up a bowl full of rice from the bin and spread the grains about the table. Then we would pick them up with our stubby fingers, one by one, each in turn in front of us, forming respective piles exactly equal, our small mounds the size of fists. They were about the same amount my mother cooked for us at dinner time, along with a few vegetables and an occasional morsel of fish or chicken or broth made from their bones. 2, Mother. Skin on bones, that's all we were, the 3 of us a wisp away from death. Then one day Father sent us a letter with money he had saved from cutting cane. Our whole clan celebrated. Granduncle killed a young pig. After we returned home that night, I noticed your lumpy face. You were still sucking on a piece of sausage between your teeth and cheek, refusing to swallow it. You were so small and did not know our luck had changed. I had to promise you several times that you would be able to eat another piece the next day and every day thereafter. 3, Younger Sister. I can recall the day my tooth came out, when the men arrived to build a bridge over the stream, and the yam we dug out as large as my arm. But these were of a later time. The stories you two recounted of our earlier hard life, You had to teach me, even though I had lived through them too. I was too young then to hold on to those as memories, my mind still learning about the daily world within my grasp. A few years ago, I read a wonderful book by Janice Stockard entitled Daughters of the Canton Delta, which described the women of Guangdong province who became relatively independent, financially and otherwise, due to their skill in silk weaving. In this book, I came across an interview with an old lady from Hotel Village. This gave me goosebumps because my own grandmother is from this very same village. I found out that the families there apparently had an unusual marriage custom. The eldest child had to get married first, then the second one next, etc. Just like in Shakespeare's Taming of the Shrew. So no skipping in line. There was a fail-safe, however, in that if the daughter next in line did not get married, the family could force her to become a spinster, formally take a vow to not marry. She got to wear her hair in a bun as a mark of her new status. For those who know Cantonese, Stockard used the term "bikru sohe." So I took this unique custom and invented a whole set of circumstances where one young woman had to face such a life-changing decision. This poem is called The Spinsters. Increasing remittances presaged his return. Bowler hat, large leather trunk, a pocket watch on a chain. It was a sudden cloudburst after a season of drought. The family was overjoyed. Finally, heaven's blessings. A pig was slaughtered for the homecoming. Neighbors flocked like cranes at dawn to gawk and shake their heads in wonder at objects never seen before. Soon matchmakers descended upon the village, iridescent dragonflies hovering above a fecund pond. One quietly scurried over to the next big town to secure the most captivating maiden, whom everyone exclaimed was a pink lily in full bloom. The troth was sealed, but for one protocol, for his eldest sister was still unmarried. She herself had once been promised to another sojourner to those islands, but he had succumbed to the white demon's gods there. His spirit then could never return. Her family had had to break off the engagement. Her spring turned into summer, hot and arid, and the stream of eligible men dwindled to a trickle. Her parents prevailed upon this eldest child to make way for her younger brother, to leave her home as a spinster. They promised to build her a small house next to theirs, which she would inherit as her share of the family property, and where after death her tablet would be placed. All her life, this eldest sister was told to work hard, that her sacrifices were for the good of the family. Washing clothes and carrying out the night soil seemed like her primary lot in the world, even as the boys played games by the stream. She was not favored by fate, she realized, and perhaps her parents offered her the best way out. Whether unripe and bitter or crawling with bugs, the persimmon in hand was still edible. With little deliberation, she took her oath of celibacy. She donned a skirt, combed back her bangs, and for the first time tied her hair into a bun. When the newlyweds were married, she sat in front of them, poised, prepared to drink their tea. A year later, her brother sailed back to the islands, leaving the village and his pregnant wife behind. He had intended to send for her at the next opportunity, but she died in childbirth, her midwives wailing. The baby survived to be cared for by her aunt. Saul embraced the new father. The ocean became a moat surrounding his heart. It was a white memory, better to be forgotten by all, although money was still sent back. For the few remaining years, his parents were still alive. He never returned home and married a native woman with whom he raised many sons. His orphan daughter grew up with his deep-set eyes and her mother's long, deft fingers. The quiet resolve, though, was nurtured by her aunt, whom the young woman chose to follow. This was the family she knew. Together they shared the small house and the vow to remain unmarried for the rest of their lives. The next section of my book features the work early Pake were involved in Hawaii. Two pieces were influenced by history books that can be obtained at the Hawaii Chinese History Center downtown. The first poem is based on a family memoir written by the descendants of Lugon, who leased the local Honolulu, an already established native Hawaiian fish pond near Pearl Harbor, from the John E. estate. Lu paid an annual rent of $1,200 plus 18 crabs and 6 mullet. I stole the details of his enterprise, what he called Singlay, for this poem entitled A Hard Night's Work. At midnight, under the rising moon, you row your small boat to the deep end of the pond, closer to the seawall, laying out your linen net in an elongated crescent. Then from the shallows in front of the mouth of the crescent, you zigzag back and forth, banging your pole on the side of your boat and smacking your paddle against the flat surface of the water. You shout at the top of your lungs, rousing the sleeping fish. They bolt into your net, which you pull up end to end, your hand over fist. You make fast work of plucking out the fatter fish snagged by their gills. Quickly, you lay out your net again and haul in another catch, and then another and another, until your boat sits low in the water, until the fish piled beside you weigh as much as you do. They gasp for air. You take deep breaths. Back on shore, you wash down your boat, stretch out your net to dry, across large racks, and sort the fish into their proper bamboo baskets to be driven into town to be sold in the morning. Some are as long as your arm, some have tapered snouts and rasping teeth, and others bulge with eyes so clear you can peer into them and foresee your own hard death. Only then do you rest, lying on your back beside the pond. You listen to the waves lapping the limestone and gaze up at the stars, tens of thousands of tiny silver fingerlings shimmering in the vast dark ocean. But you are fast asleep before dawn. As a footnote, after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, this and other fish ponds in the vicinity were filled in. It is now, I believe, in the area of the Ted Macarena golf course. Hawaii Chinese History Center also published a book on Maui Chinese families, and I found one of them, that of Chung Konyu of Lahaina, very intriguing. How all of his family took on various tasks to help turn taro into poi for sale. It is the inspiration for Poi Factory. Our family worked in shifts and took on different chores. Eldest sister and I woke up before dawn to prepare the day's meals for everyone. I also collected the kiawe from the shed and the water we needed for the steamer. My father and mother knew several languages spoken in our neighborhood and greeted the farmers who arrived throughout the day. They came with their mule carts loaded with heavy burlap bags full of taro. We scrubbed off the mud and fibers and placed the corms on wooden racks in our oven. Younger brother and younger sister were responsible for tending to the coal fire, making sure the pan of water was kept boiling, but also that it did not evaporate out. They took turns as well, wetting down the canvas draped over the oven. The corms, which had been steamed from the day before, were gathered up by my uncle and elder brothers. They peeled off the poisonous skin and with stone hammers pounded the taro. Some liked to buy just the mash. For others, we kneaded in water to sell as paste. All of us helped pack the poi into smaller cloth bags, weighing 5 pounds each. These were picked up by peddlers, who then spread out on chosen routes to call on households across our valley. Sometimes, some of us took breaks to eat a midday snack, though not all at the same time. Whenever one task needed more hands, there were enough of us who dropped our own work to help out. Only when the sun was setting did we all sit down together for dinner, and then we went to bed, except for our parents, who stayed up by the kerosene lamp to settle the accounts and plan for the next day, which turned out to be the same as every other day, year in and year out, until I left home to get married. In the 1930s, a sociologist named Paul Siu interviewed dozens of Chinese laundrymen in the Chicago area. This study turned into his dynamite book, The Chinese Laundryman. Much of this work is in the earthy voices of the men talking story about their lives, their hard work, their loneliness, their few pleasures. In the book, Seal provided a floor plan of a typical laundry, and I used this plan as a guide to write my next poem, The Laundryman. You would think our work would be fresh and clean, bathed as we are in soap and water, but I can only see in front of me the day's crumpled shirts full of sweat and grime, the urine-stained underwear and mud-splattered pants, napkins smeared with food and drink, sometimes bedsheets with menstrual blood, or handkerchiefs caked in snot, all gathering in the humid air in small, spent piles in the back room. They will need to be steeped in hot water and scrubbed over the washboard, then cranked through stiff rollers to be wrung out to dry and pressed down flat by a sad iron straight from the stove. Only later, as eyes adjust to night, can they be fluffed and folded, wrapped in rice paper, neatly tied into separate bundles and placed on a shelf behind the counter. Only then will they be ready for waiting for you to pick up at your leisure. Nowadays, our social media trumpets every creative masterpiece from celebrity chefs. My next poem offers a different perspective of restaurant work. It's entitled The Banquet. Before, you cut off the bottom stem and then lengthwise slice the white cabbage into quarters. With the leaves facing down, you shake their tips in a bowl of water to remove any bugs. In another bowl of water, you mix in some salt and then lay in the clams. Throughout the day, you change the water and the salt. As they settle in, the clams express the grit inside their shells. You try to pick out bits of feathers stuck to the bird's nest made from swallow saliva. It takes good eyes and nimble fingers. If it is too dry, you moisten the jelly to loosen it up. After peeling the shrimp, their heads and legs, their shells, segment by segment, you make shallow incisions along the curve of their backs to pluck out any veins blackened by waste, washing them off your fingers into a cup of lukewarm tea. You cut the coil of pig intestines into tubes the length of your thumb. Then you push a clove of garlic which you have steeped in oil through one open end, working it all the way to the other to scour out any crap. After, there are leftovers, sometimes braised shark's fin or fish maw or snow ears fungus, but you also see the cigarette ash in the soup and the half-eaten drumstick and instead throw them all into the trash. You soak the plates and bowls in hot soapy water. After a while, you rinse everything off and wipe them dry, stacking each in its place on the back shelves, ready for use the next time. Some of the still hot tea you pour over the chopping block to help break down any grease when you scrape it with your cleaver. You whisk the wok tube with a few quick swishes with a stiff bamboo brush. You sweep the floor, making sure to get into the corners, the dirt and grime that you collect in your pan, you dump out the door. It is the same when you mop, bringing out the dark water onto the street. You set out a tin of water for the neighborhood cat and shut the windows and then turn down the lamps. Everyone else has gone, and when you leave, you carry out the garbage. As a footnote to this poem, each of the tasks that I have described for both before and after the meal was taken from my own personal experiences. My parents often entertained at home when I was growing up. My father did the cooking, and I helped with some of the prep work and the cleanup for their large dinners. In the old days, some young girls were sold by their families to work for others. Julia Flynn Seiler, in her book, The White Devil's Daughters, writes, Moijai means little sister in the Cantonese dialect and refers to children who would become household slaves. So I tried to imagine the life of one of them in this next poem. Little sister. My grandfather did not like me because I was not a boy. My mother said to give me up since I was an extra mouth to feed. My father quickly sold me off to cover all of his gambling debts. My paper father bought me since he knew a way to bring me over. An immigration man let me in as they gave him enough silver. My paper mother called me little sister, but I served her as a house slave. But then they sold me once again because I had become too old. The brothel keeper bought me because I was still so young. One man paid a bonus for the privilege of being my first. Other men kept paying for me because they had no wives here. And even later, they still visited, although I had fallen sick. I died a short while later because I could not afford the herbs. I never had a funeral as no one had the money for it. My body is buried in an unmarked grave, as if I had not lived at all. In December 1899, a Chinaman was discovered to have died from bubonic plague. Since the Black Death was then widespread in China, the authorities in Hawaii quarantined all of Chinatown with a lockdown imposed and militia patrolling the streets to prevent anyone from going in or out. They also instituted controlled burns of any building where new victims of the plague were found. Unfortunately, on January 20th, 1900, one burn got out of control, causing conflagration that consumed the entire 16 blocks. A detailed account of this sorry mess can be found in James Moore's book, Plague and Fire. I read this book during the first year of our recent COVID pandemic, so I got a chance to compare my lockdown with the quarantine imposed 120 years previous. At that time, I got very anxious about my own mortality. My thoughts turned to the death of civilizations. I happened to also read an article by Bill Buford on making bread in France and came upon this observation by one bread master. He said, "What I learned from my father and grandfather is what they learned from their fathers and grandfathers. There is a handing off between generations." The word he used was transmettre. Le goût et les valeurs sont transmis. Flavors and values, those are the qualities that are transmitted. So I wrote this next poem, still set in Chinatown under quarantine in 1900, as a meditation on my own existential concerns. It's entitled Flavors and Values. As kids, we grabbed a clutch of rice stalks, as many as there were of us. One of us held the whole handful within his fist, his palm hiding the bottom ends. The tops tamped down looked level to the rest of us. The first kid would pick a stalk, and another kid another one, and so on until each of us got a stalk. We would compare them, and whoever had the shortest would be the loser and could not play anymore. He kept his stalk. So began another round. Again we would pick and then get another loser, who would then drop out. This went on until there was only one of us left, the winner. Looking back, I see such disappointments helped us to accept our fates. At some point we understood that all of us would die someday, perhaps one of us today, perhaps others decades away. Rich, poor, kind or cruel, righteous or foolhardy, pure or sullied, esteemed or scorned. The only solace was that our lifetimes overlapped. While each of us will die and die alone, our collective lives will persevere and thrive. Our Chinatown is cordoned off by armed guards patrolling our borders, making sure none of us escapes, as if all of us are infected by this plague, or soon will be. We are like tiny fish packed into rectangular tins, slowly drowning in our own oil. Now we will die together without survivors, our only hope for immortality. No sons for mother to share her doleful stories with about her late father. No apprentice for the noodle maker to reveal his kneading secrets to. No pupils to try to surprise their teacher with recitations from memory of his most beloved poems. All that will remain are these buildings in ruins, these streets empty and still, mute testaments to a world of lost flavors and values that were once handed down through our generations. According to the 1900 census, the ratio of Chinese men to women was about 6.5 to 1, mainly because single men were the first of the immigrants to come. Then, after annexation, The United States' existing racist exclusion acts were extended to our newly created territory of Hawaii. As a consequence, it became very difficult to bring in any Chinese, male or female. So for companionship, some bachelors turned to prostitutes. I learned from an article by Joan Hori, a librarian here at the university, that many of the latter were actually Japanese, unlike the so-called wives of 100 men in California who were Chinese. So I wanted to write a piece from the point of view of one of these women. Perhaps thinking it would be more of an authentic voice, I envisioned her thinking to herself in traditional Japanese haiku. So I wrote English versions, that is, short poems of 3 lines long with 5, then 7, then 5 syllables. The Chinese were the best customers. I sit patiently, my kimono neatly pressed, ready to disrobe. These Chinamen stink, their breath, their clothes, their pigtails, even their money. One man, $1, each dripping cane in the sun for 35 cents. A long row of sheds look into the glass window. I am with the lamp. After his ruttings, he stays on top, hugging me. I am his comfort. I don't look like them. I am not their village girls, yet they visit me. In this port city, we accept every coin. I serve as a bank. Mother taught me shame, but naked is what I trade. I now sell my breasts. I ask for a break. I must hunt under the bed for my jar of lard. Sipping tea outside, I hear songs from my homeland. My neighbor is sad. Today, I'm bleeding, so do kitchen work. Instead, glad there is no child. I love papayas, but cannot shop at one stall. The man's face turns red. The gaunt old-timer scrimped and saved for months on end, but can't get it up. At home, pigs do it. I'm not any different, one more animal. What can she do? She frets over her swelling that it will be dark. Pake always smile. Kanaka will tip their hats. My people will sneer. I was pretty once. Men were chasing after me. Now I wait for them. The clerk brings a knife and lays it next to my head, savoring my fear. The chef's wife arrived. He waited for her for years, so will come no more. We pay off the cops, but this one wants even more, so I am his tip. Our owner slaps me. I have nowhere else to go. I hoard my complaints. I open my trunk. The camphor stirs memories. Mother's pressed flower. Covered in makeup, a phantom haunts my mirror, the white of morning. As a footnote, the authorities tried to contain the brothels in Chinatown within a certain section bounded by Hawaii River and Nuuanu Street. So many of you may be familiar with this area, but perhaps we're not aware of its unique earlier history. There are also many Pake who decided to marry native Hawaiian women, settling down and starting families here. So I wanted to write a poem from the point of view of a young woman trying to get into her head, seeing if I could think and speak in her language. So I turned to Mary Kavena Pukui's Olelo Noeau, her indispensable collection of Hawaiian sayings. Early on, I discovered in this book a multitude of phrases about sex, which fit into my idea that my two protagonists' first attraction was physical. So for this poem, I appropriated about 20 Hawaiian idioms or slang words, plus about 10 Chinese ones. A wife reminisce. I bore him sons and also daughters and thought, and though we loved our children, we loved making them even more, or so it seemed in those frantic young days before we were married, before we called ourselves husband and wife, the dragon and phoenix, the needle and the flowers making sweet lay. In those days, we were like fledglings hiding in the bosom of the banana grove where the valley wall starts their steep climb. As soon as we were out of sight, he would be at my breast, my hands yanking down his pants in one swoop, our bodies twisting and falling like fish hooks entangled like wrestlers caught in a deathly hold. We would find that soul-worn spot on the ground. He would cut a few large leaves to place under me so that my back would not get scratched. We did little talking, our alien tongues busy elsewhere, like our grasping hands, our swollen thighs. Often we would snuggle together on our sides, he at my back, nibbling on my earlobes, long ones which he believed foretold my longevity, driving me to distraction like an eel. I would engulf his cane stalk, nursing his sweet juices, or he would enter me from behind into the depths of my sand crab hole, quickly, as if squeezed by our fear that if this were all to life, we could never get enough of it. At other times, he would suckle my nipple for what seemed like half a day, and my breast was opened like wide eyes. I loved his rump, smooth as the moon, his curve without a flaw, like the curl of a perfect wave, self-contained and mesmerizing. I often raked my fingernails there, marking furrows in his skin. I always marveled at his resilience. I taught him secret names for my body parts and his eyes unwaveringly would follow me as I spread out beneath him like a pool. Like a breadfruit blossom, my bud stood erect, waiting for his snout to root and prod. I was the chili pepper burning his dark lips. He drank me like a gushing spring, feigning shyness as he leaned over, wiping his mouth to whisper about my taste, salty and wet. I made it a point to fix my eyes on his as I came, or I tried to, wild and gleaming, then turning glazed at the point of no return, to carry him up into my dreams. All I wanted was to live those heedless moments as if our little deaths would never die. We resolved to live together, two large rocks standing in a forlorn sea. His friends thought him crazy from too much sex and feared he would never return then to his land of flowers. My mother banished me even after he recited the proper speech I taught him to say. He was, she warned, a vagrant trespassing our protected sea, a plover who, when his breast turned dark, would fly away. The cords were broken, never to be mended. Like lovers of old, we snatched embers from the fire to scar our skin as medals of our troth. We rode side saddle to the other side of the mountain and lived by ourselves. I taught him how to swim. He taught me how to sew. We taught each other kisses that neither of us thought we knew. We farmed and foraged by day. At dusk, I danced my hula, and he showed me secret martial arts sets passed down from his heroes of long ago. We would save our candle nuts, and as the moon rose, we would lie outside our lean-to, making love in the owl's light, the fingertips of the mountain breeze tickling our skin. Together we gathered pomegranates and mountain apples in the shade. We had our babies soon after, and our days became filled with me and my stout belly, leaning over my taro patch, and he and our beloved chasing after his pigs. But we would still have our moments when we would bring our small ones to bathe at the mountain, at the mouth of the river where it meets the sea, our naked bodies dark as lava, glistening, one sitting behind the other in turn to braid each other's newly washed hair. I'm going to go over time and read some more smaller focused poems. Okay. He says it's okay. The essay that my father wrote while attending the University of Hawaii was primarily an autobiography about himself and his family. In it, he included an anecdote about how he first started going to school in Chinatown. So most of the details in my poem are taken from this account. And education. They sat me down and asked me if I wanted to go. Eldest sister was going there and told me there were mostly girls. I liked hanging around the store, playing with other kids down by the stream, or just staying at home. Also, some said they punished with a stick. So I said no, and that was that. Then they asked younger brother, and he said yes. A few days later, after dinner, we all gathered around him. Our parents presented him with a leather bag with an inkwell and some paper and a lump of sweets. They also gave him a special school name and praised him, foreseeing that one day he would become a scholar or some government official. Early the next morning, he went with eldest sister. I missed him every day. The men at the store smirked, saying I was moping about, and told me to join them. So I asked my parents, and a few days later, they gave me my school name and my own bag and candy. except there was no ceremony. I just went along with my brother and sister, and that was that. I used to live in a condominium, which in the back had a stairway outside for fire escape purposes. Every morning I used to exercise by going up and down the flight of stairs. At the same time, there was an old lady who swam in the small swimming pool next to the bottom of the stairway. After her swim, she sometimes worked on an adjacent small garden. One day, as I started my exercises, I saw a few people crowded around the lady who was lying on the ground. So I stole this incident to use in my next poem. It's called The Neighbor. The two of them saw each other most every day. At dawn, he would practice his sword sets at the edge of the stream near his coops. She lived on the opposite bank, a squat woman with gray hair down to her waist, her white dress threadbare and splotched, leaning over her vegetable garden, watering and weeding and turning over the soil. Speaking to them, he supposed as if each cabbage and onion and yam were children of her own. They would make a point to catch each other's eye, exchanging greeting nods from afar. He heard she rarely left her home, as her relatives took care of everything. He never saw her at the general store or on his way to town to make deliveries. Now he regrets that he did not get to know her more. This morning, when he sees her lying there on her side as if sleeping beside the papaya tree, just a body on the ground, her family hushed and solemn around her. He thinks of crossing over to console them and to tell them that maybe he could have helped had he but come out sooner, but he is hesitant to intrude on their grief. Instead, by rote, he bows, rooting himself in his stance, his hand clasping the hilt of his sword, its blade sharp side up in the crease of his elbow. He raises his hand, palms down, then returns them to his sides. He takes his opening steps, going through his movements slowly, deliberately, his mind focused, breathing deeply, breaking into a sweat, his sword skimming, sweeping and wheeling, crossing the sky, chasing the moon and spreading out his wings. An uncle of mine contracted tuberculosis and died here at the age of 22. One of the earliest memories his son had was of the little bell which his bedridden father rang whenever he needed something. This family anecdote inspired me to write this poem entitled Eldest Brother. Eldest brother was bedridden, his face pale as ivory, worn from worry, his body shriveled, skin peeling off bones. His lungs were patches of taro, ravaged by a nighttime storm. Exhausted, he kept coughing for days on end, spitting out blood. We kept him in his own corner of the room, with blankets hung enshrouding him. Still, we would talk story, although it was mostly us who did the talking. There was always his hacking. When we brought in his spoon or took out his spittoon, he would speak in a hoarse whisper, slowly and deliberately. What time is it? I hope this new medicine works. I want to walk outside. How is the crop of rice doing? Once he had been so vigorous, delivering what we had harvested from the fields into town, always watching over the rest of us, stopping us from quarreling and reminding everyone how bountiful this life was, so much better than the one we had left behind. When someone had to speak up, it was always him. He smiled at our jokes, but his eyes were sad. After he died, we steamed his hat, soaked his blankets and cot in boiling water, scrubbed out the room, including the ceiling, and buried his corpse, so light, deep in the earth. We only saved his bell, this last trace of him, the one he had used to summon us. It was the size of a lotus poised to bloom, and even amid his coughing and blood, it always rang clear and true. There were two friends of mine, husband and wife, who faced some challenges in their old age. The wife with several health problems, while the husband has had to deal with the loss of his short-term memory. A few years ago, the wife died, and the husband was unable to remember her death, which caused complications when friends came over to offer condolences. For whatever reason, I was piqued by what I had learned and adapted this husband's response into a poem about two cousins who came to Hawaii around the time period of my book. Remember. You can remember chasing pigs with your cousin the same age as you, growing up together in a village among a large extended family. You can remember vomiting in turn on the rocking ship when the two of you, still in your teens, journeyed to our islands. You can remember digging ditches side by side in a taro patch sequestered within the hush of that valley. You can remember both of you moving into town to take jobs in your kinsman's coffee shop. You waiting on tables and he in the kitchen as a short order cook, always concerned. You can remember enjoying your retirements, spending your days in the district clubhouse, playing mahjong, sharing a freshly baked pie, and catching up on every small rumor about the uprisings back home. But nowadays you cannot remember what you ate for breakfast that morning, or what you read in the newspaper last night, or the fruit you often hoarded, which you kept finding behind your bed weeks later, shrunk and moldy. Neither can you remember that last week we discovered your cousin lying on the top bunk, having died in his sleep, like an incense stick reaching its destined end. And when we told you that you broke down and sobbed, and then that when an old friend called to offer condolences, you did not know what he was talking about, and so you were shocked once more to learn that your cousin had died, and again became so agitated and wept, the swarm of bees returning, only to soon fly away. And this was repeated each time when 3 more old-timers visited you, making us all distraught, so much so that we must decide to hold back the others who show up later. It is of no good use, we say to each other, as you will not remember anyway, anyone who now comes, much less why. Friends, old pipes. Bits of tobacco littered the box. There was a wooden rack, ashtrays, some used pipe cleaners, and maybe a dozen pipes. Gingerly he fingered the bowls, now charred and dry, the well-worn stems, the chewed-up mouthpieces. He asked us which were the favorites. We could not say. He chose a few briarwoods, both smooth and gnarled, a meerschaum, pale as ivory, one with a curved stem, reminiscent of detectives, caressing these souvenirs of their past lives, of him and of his old friend, sitting down around the dining table in our old home, the sweet smoke whispering through their laughter and their sighs. He was not an avid smoker, I recall, but maybe he wanted those old pipes to bring back that love one last time with one hot kiss. I have lived in Manoa Valley for most of my life. In the 1970s, I started noticing around where Long's drugstore is, it is about halfway and going up halfway up Wa'ahila Ridge. There are a few lean-tos where I presumed hippies were living then. At one point, I decided to write about a Chinaman doing the same thing 70 years prior, and went back to reading David Hinton. He has written about the influence of Taoism and Chan Buddhism on ancient Chinese and even contemporary Western poetry. I've tried to incorporate some of Hinton's ideas on man's integral connection with nature in this next poem, imagining an old-timer becoming a recluse in the mountains in his last days. Within the dragon's breath. When I first arrived inside the heart of the valley, the morning mist still enshrouded the mountaintops, their fluted cliffs, a dance of sunlight and shadows surrounding our patchwork of jade-green farms like a tomb. Years of taro and mud indeed drained my life force, a lotus once blossoming as an unquenchable fire. I retreated up to the ridgeline, my clothes ragged, the small of my back a gnarl of knots and woes. Now I huddle in my hut beneath a stand of sandalwood. At dawn I awaken to birds calling to their mates. I am everywhere engulfed by the clouds, and in the dim light all of my senses are alert. At these times the only thing that matters is the present, within the dragon's breath, billowing, unfurling, sometimes damp and dense, sometimes effervescent, and then in a flash this fog is gone. Instead, below, my eyes follow the far river as it spills out like the arms of a lover outstretched into the sea, into the hard blue of the ocean, of the horizon, and inexorably to the land of our ancestors beyond. My last poem is one where I would like to disabuse you of the notion that all of my poems are derived from some specific reading or experience. In fact, several were simply made up out of whole cloth, creatio ex nihilo. So I just chose not to share them for this reading. However, I'm going to end with one that is one of my favorites, a pipe dream of what I imagine the streets of Chinatown might have been like 125 years ago. At dusk. The tabby cat has made her usual rounds, but these days are shorter now, and she keens the darkness coming sooner. She hugs the walls and sneaks across the alleyway, one lone meteor rushing headlong home. Behind the restaurant, amid lengthening shadows, the cashier beats an empty can with his spoon, calling her to a dinner of leftover fish heads, their gelatinous eyes a shimmer of pearls, promising a succulent return to the primal sea. The cook inside fires up his wok, deeply patinaed, stir-frying slices of pork belly and vegetables, then adding a dollop of his secret shrimp paste, this tiny seed quickly blossoming into a bouquet permeating the courtyard as the light recedes. The old-timer, hanging his threadbare wash, revels in the savory aroma of this serendipity. In the gloaming, he breaks out into song, his taut line of bleach-white clothes pegs paddling in unison into the gathering wind. On the balcony, the prostitute hums along, recalling the folk melodies of her childhood before silvery moons waxed and waned. She sips from the restorative tea of her reverie, reluctant to leave when her shift begins. The baker has spied on her from his window. He breaks away as it is time for his early bed. He sleeps through the violins rehearsing next door, his snores a chorus to their two-stringed melancholies. He will wake up refreshed before the cocks crow. Thank you.
We do have some time for questions or comments or just general responses.
I can ask. Wing Tek.
Lauren.
How did you decide on the parts going together? What kind of order? It's not chronological, it's kind of reflections or thematic or some kind of connections that you wanted to make.
This book has 6 parts to it. It was written primarily over 8 years. There's about 82 poems. There are a few that were written in the 90s, and then most of them were written between 2015 and 2023. The parts that I put them into were as follows. One was about the diaspora, the separation of families or people in the homeland and people in Hawaii. The second was about work. So I tried to describe a lot of jobs that the Chinamen had been involved with. The third exclusively was on the quarantine and fire in 1900. The fourth is more like some of the diversions that the Chinamen were involved with: prostitution, opium, gambling. And then the fifth is about other things that they did in their spare time, like getting romantically involved with women, but also having families and whatnot. And then the sixth is about the Chinamen in their old age without descendants who face death and no progeny. So those are the 6. I'm trying to give you a brief background on what you can read when you buy the book. And I can add that the third section on the fire and the quarantine, a couple of weeks ago at the Downtown Arts Center, that's what I did. Was I read almost all of that section because the Downtown Arts Center is located on Umano Street, or if you know, and it's right across the street from where the fire, from the 16 blocks that were consumed. So I kind of thought that was an appropriate reading to give at that particular location. Yes.
Thank you for that reading, Wing Tek. Wanted to ask, we tend to bring visitors and job candidates to Chinatown, to our restaurants, and we almost always talk about the fire and talk about how what what we're seeing now is different from what would have been for the fire. How important was it for you to go there and to be in that space as you were writing these poems?
Well, I'm there every day.
Every day.
I mean, I've worked in Chinatown since I came back to Hawaii in 1976, so I've been there continuously. So I've seen the changes from then till now, but also tried to understand what it was like prior to when I was there. My father was there before, and before him, my grandfather, as I mentioned, my grandfather had a store there. So our family has had this sort of continuous history with the area. And so, yeah, we've seen a lot of changes, but we know what happened during that one period where there was the fire, and then there had to be a lot of reconstruction and work to try to rebuild Chinatown after that.
So imagine there's a kind of pentimento sense, like you can see what's there now, but under it, there are the memories of the structures.
There's a very wonderful book by Gary Coover called Honolulu Chinatown, which some of you may know about. And that's really a nice introduction to Chinatown, because it does try to go through what's there now, but also what was there even prior to the fire in the 1800s, if you can find records. And so it goes by parcel, building by building, really, and tries to show the history of it. So that's a nice book to look at if you're really interested in the history of Chinatown. Gary.
I've known you for a while.
Yes.
I know that you're a businessman. I know that you're one of the richest people in Hawaii. I know that you sometimes spout words and you call them poems. But you write about the common people, and you signify their lives. You make them interesting. You talk about all the different kind of facets, and you don't write about rich Chinamen and stuff like that. Why? Are you a communist or socialist?
I have not yet been promoted to that status or station as you have been.
What's your purpose of writing?
But I think because there have been stories about people who have been successful. Also, there have been a lot of stories by people who have who know about their immediate ancestors. What I wanted to write about were people who did not have descendants, who were unable to have progeny, and so were forgotten about. I can remember my grandfather and my grandmother because there's records, there's this lineage that I have, but there are other people working with him that are forgotten about now, mainly because they have no descendants. They're forgotten about by all the rest of us because we're just focused on our immediate ancestors. So I wanted to try to tell the stories or give voice to people who have been forgotten about during this particular era. Whether they were rich or poor, I still wanted to kind of tell their stories if I could, or imagine what their stories might have been like. So that was part of my mission, is to tell the stories of people who didn't have descendants, really, who were not included in this whole thing with ancestor worship, because ancestor worship, or the folk religions of China, are really important, except if you don't have descendants, you're in big trouble existentially, because there's nobody to visit your grave, there's nobody to remember you, and there's nobody to write poems about you. Great.
Yeah, I'm following up on this in terms of method. You were describing to a certain degree. Would you come up with a particular premise or a particular position that you were interested in exploring, a particular kind of person who wouldn't have that, and then you would go and do the research and the archival stuff and try and find one or locate them? Or would you actually put yourself in the archival pool, switch around, and occasionally come up with something that you think might be interesting?
The
Or
latter.
is it both?
It's more the latter. I mean, I've tried to push, coming up with a story or something first, but, and that's been successful sometimes, but not always. I think most of the time, I do some reading or I think about something and something piques my interest. There's a hook to something that says, oh, this could be turned into a poem. And so I appropriate that particular anecdote or incident and then try to create a story around it. Like the one about the spinsters. The only connection was, oh, this woman is from the same village as my grandmother. Oh, that was neat. But then I read more closely about this unique marriage custom. And then I said, oh, maybe I can try to turn this into a poem. But I had to build a whole backstory or circumstances to fit into this kind of marriage custom. Everything else is fiction, but I used the core of it is really the marriage custom that I discovered while reading this book. So it was the book first.
The Japanese prostitute.
The Japanese prostitute one, basically, again, I read Joan Horry's article, and I said, oh, I didn't know that most of the prostitutes were Japanese. This is like over 200 Japanese prostitutes and, a handful of Chinese and Haoli and whoever else was predominantly, by a wide margin, Japanese. And I said, oh, I didn't know this. I thought Chinese would patronize Chinese prostitutes, but that wasn't the case in Hawaii as it was in the Bay Area, for instance. So thinking about that more, I said, okay, maybe I should try to write about this particular unique situation, unique only to Honolulu. And so I said, okay, how can I do that? And I said, maybe I can do it through the voice of the Japanese prostitute. So I tried that route, and I said, well, maybe I can try haiku. The English version of haiku, five syllables, 7 syllables, 5 syllables. So I tried that, and you got the result. Whether it's successful or not, that's up to you to decide. But that's what I tried to do. Yes.
Your grandparents, did you know your grandparents?
No, they died before I was born.
Did they migrate to Hawaii?
Yes, yeah. My grandfather came in 1886. Yes.
Well, I was very impressed, and you did an excellent job.
Thank you.
Buy the book.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that's the next thing.
$20.
I'd like, Earl already asked us to, but I'd like to ask you again to thank Wing Tek for his reading and buy his book if you haven't already.